This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream, a subscription streaming service that offers over 2,000 documentaries and non-fiction titles from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. Get unlimited access starting at just $2.99 a month. Also, for you guys, the first 30 days are completely free at curiositystream.com/brainfood, link below. If you're looking for a specific recommendation from me, well, actually, I didn't see this documentary on CuriosityStream. I don't think I had CuriosityStream back there. It's a documentary called Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical? And basically that's what's so great about CuriosityStream. They've got documentaries from all over the place. They just bring the best of the best together for your enjoyment. It's available on many platforms: web app, Roku, Android, Xbox One, and well, the list goes on. It's also available worldwide. So, like I said, just go to curiositystream.com/brainfood for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and non-fiction series. And if you use the promo code BRAINFOOD, you'll get a month for free, and let's get into it. The origin of the keyboard starts, unsurprisingly, with the first typewriters. There were a variety of typewriter-like devices around going back to the 18th century before one Christopher Latham Sholes, with some help from a few other guys, he came up with one that would become the first commercially successful typewriter in the 1870s. Much like typewriters since, Sholes' device used letters and characters on the ends of rods, which are called type bars. When a key was struck, the type bar would swing up and hit the ink-coated tape, which would transfer the image onto the paper. The difference between this and more modern incarnations, however, is that this first device more or less mimicked the layout of a piano keyboard and positioned the keys in alphabetical order in 2 rows. This arrangement had a number of problems, but most commonly, as people got faster at typing, it caused the type bars of the most commonly used combination of letters of the alphabet to be positioned close together, so when the keys were hit one right after the other at any fast speed, the keys would jam. To solve this, the keys were rearranged to put commonly used consecutive letters further away from each other in order to reduce jams. While you might be thinking, and it is widely claimed, that this was to fix the problem via making people type slower, well, all evidence actually points to this simply being to position the arms of these letters better so they'd be less likely to cross. It should be noted here that you'll often read nowadays that this whole jamming story is a myth and that Sholes was simply trying to cater to telegraph operators' usage and making the change. Everyone claiming this, including the Smithsonian Magazine, which normally does a lot better research, cites one 2011 paper on the prehistory of QWERTY by Koichi Yasoka and Motoko Yasoka of Kyoto University as their source. However, what the people parroting this fail to mention is that if you actually go and read the paper, as we want to do when researching, this paper is just speculation with no real direct evidence to back up their claims. The authors of the paper further incorrectly state that the idea that it was a type bar jamming as motivation didn't pop up until the 1980s. In truth, the idea that the change was spurred by the type bar jamming came about in 1923 in the book The History of the Typewriter, developed by authors from the Herkheimer Historical Society. So, what was their source for this claim? Well, it was none other than Sholes' notes and many other correspondence concerning the development of the typewriter. Now, normally what we'd go and do is then go read the notes and letters to find where Sholes actually says this in order to verify it for ourselves, but in this case, while the letters and notes do still exist, they only seem to exist in the state archives of Madison, Wisconsin, and unfortunately we don't exactly have the budget to send someone out there to verify. So that's where we had to stop digging in that certain rabbit hole, and if anyone from Madison, Wisconsin wants to go and dig up that for us, well, we'd be much obliged. In the meantime, given the authors here aren't likely to have made this jamming story up out of thin air, and we're using Sholes' notes and letters as the base of their work, it seems probable that jamming really was the motivation for the change. Whether you're on board with us on that one or not, one thing the aforementioned 2011 paper did get right was once it was clear a change was needed to stop the jamming, Sholes really did work with telegraphists on the final layouts to try to cater to their needs as best he could. But this shouldn't be much of a surprise given these were among his first customers. In fact, his literal first sale of the 1868 model was to Porter's Telegraph College in Chicago. In any event, in 1868, in collaboration with several other people, Sholes settled on an arrangement of the letters on the keyboard for better spacing between popular keys used in combination. The result was that this initially made it difficult for people to find the letters they needed to type efficiently, unlike when the letters were in alphabetical order. However, thanks to less likelihood of jamming once one became proficient in the new layout, it was found to be a faster typing experience. Of course, at this point in history, people were still predominantly using the hunt and peck method rather than 10-finger typing, so nobody was blazing fast or anything like that. As for this keyboard, though, it was the beginning of some semblance of the QWERTY keyboard which we know and love today, which first appeared in 1872, though it wasn't quite exactly the one we have yet. For that, we have to fast forward ever so slightly. The first, more widely available typewriter machine found its way onto the market in 1874 through Remington & Sons. This device was called the Remington No. 1, or sometimes the Sholes and Glidden typewriter, with Remington & Sons acquiring the rights to it and its near QWERTY keyboard. This, however, did not sell well. 4 years later, however, after slight modifications to the arrangements of the keyboard were made, we finally have the QWERTY layout in the famed Remington & Sons Remington No. 2 model, which also notably included the ability to type both capital and lowercase letters by using the Shift key. And if you've ever wondered why the Shift key is called that, well, wonder no more. The Shift key received its name because it caused the carriage to shift position in order to type either a lowercase or capital letter, which were on the same type bar. Although the Shift key we use on our keyboards today does not cause the machine to shift mechanically, well, the name stuck. In any event, as the typewriter rose in popularity, people stopped complaining about the weird arrangement of keys and started memorizing the keyboard and learning how to type efficiently. What particularly helped the sales of the Remington No. 2 model was that Remington offered classes for a very small fee to learn to type proficiently with the keyboard. They also offered certification in the keyboard, which was a good thing to have for a typist who was looking for a job, and further good for companies who wanted to ensure they could get someone proficient right away by just looking at their resume. Within a little over a decade, there were over 100,000 typewriters using this QWERTY layout. As it came to dominate, although other alternate keyboards tried to break into the market, most people decided to stay with the QWERTY layout, largely due to the widespread popularity of the typewriters that used it. The nail in the coffin to other layouts occurred in 1893 when Remington and 4 other major typewriter makers all merged and set the QWERTY as the standard industry layout. There is one other layout, however, that over the decades has had a small amount of traction and induced many a flame war on the interwebs, often touted as superior to the QWERTY for many reasons, and that's the Dvorak layout. This has its origins in the 1930s when Professor August Dvorak of Washington State University set out to develop a more user-friendly keyboard. He ultimately changed the layout such that all the vowels and the 5 most commonly used consonants were arranged on the home row: A, O, E, U, I, D, H, T, N, S. The general idea of this keyboard was to try to minimize the need to move your fingers for anything other than commonly used words. For example, with the Dvorak keyboard, a person could type approximately 400 of the English language's most common words just by using the keys of the home row, compared to in the ballpark of 100 of those most common words on the QWERTY keyboard. It is also optimized such that you'll more frequently alternate hands pressing the keys to further increase speed. So, does this actually speed up typing? Well, no, not in any real-world noticeable way. It turns out, in the countless studies done on this, the general consensus seems to be that the average increase in words per minute is typically only about 2%, up to 10% or so, give or take, depending on what study you want to go with. So, for example, if you used to type at 60 words per minute, you might expect something like at most 66 words per minute or so once you take the necessary time to become proficient at the new arrangement. That said, some people see much higher improvement rates, even sometimes on the order of 30 to 100% boost in words per minute. However, if you look closer, people that see these types of huge improvements tend to be people that learn to type on QWERTY keyboards without any formal training and generally had suboptimal speeds because of this. Thus, if trained properly on the QWERTY keyboard, they'd also have seen a large increase in words per minute. As you might imagine from this, actually testing which is superior, if either, has been a bit difficult, given there's potential for a lot of noise in the data with so many people at so many varied levels of proficiency on the QWERTY keyboard before being formally trained on Dvorak. Thus, in an effort to get around this problem, there have been studies that have taken the humans out of the experiment. Exhibit A January 2006 paper titled The Great Keyboard Debate, QWERTY vs. Dvorak by Catherine Hemstork of the University of Waikato. In this study, she measured things like the average travel time it took for fingers to move up and down rows and press and the like for giving strokes on the keyboard. She then took 21 lengthy books, including Moby Dick, and simply added up the time it would take to type those texts out using the Dvorak and QWERTY layouts given given the known average movement times for proficient typers, an ingeniously simple and accurate way to take the human element out. So, what were the results? Timing-wise, even with such a large sample size, neither keyboard was really faster than the other in the general case. She summed up the study by stating, "The Dvorak Layout is the most efficient because it requires the least amount of effort to type some given text, even though it takes approximately the same amount of time as the QWERTY layout." At this point, you Dvorak aficionados out there might already be heading to the comments to tell us that Dvorak's initial studies, particularly one conducted with the US Navy in 1944 looking at his keyboard superiority, showed far more glowing results in increased speeds, a whopping 74% increase and reduction of typos by 68% once the keyboardists were trained up. The problem was that follow-up studies, such as one done by the US General Services Administration in 1953, among others around this time, couldn't replicate these results, though some speculate these studies were rigged against the Dvorak. Whether that's true or not, a surprising number of studies have been done since, and as noted, they haven't been able to replicate the original results either, except in cases where someone hadn't bothered to be properly trained on QWERTY in the first place. Whatever you want to believe on whether the 1950s studies were rigged or not, these studies ultimately killed the Dvorak keyboard's momentum, as the majority of people and companies didn't want to commit the time or resources that it would take to train on a new keyboard if the improvement was only marginal at best. And since then, not much has really changed on that front. That said, proponents of the Dvorak keyboard who accept that the Dvorak isn't actually noticeably faster do point out there are other benefits to the Dvorak beyond speed, primarily in less wrist and finger fatigue and supposedly fewer typos, though the data on this latter one is mixed despite widespread claims. While less finger and wrist fatigue does indeed appear to be a genuine benefit, proponents of just sticking with the QWERTY tend to be quick to point out that it takes a rather long time to master a new keyboard layout, with people who've made the switch to Dvorak generally claiming it took them about 1 to 6 months to reach the proficiency that they have on QWERTY. And further, it takes an awful lot of continual typing before most find themselves fatigued on the QWERTY layout anyway. Thus, for the majority of people, it's probably not worth the effort of retraining. Further, QWERTY disciples point out that losing proficiency in the QWERTY layout that's pretty much everywhere is potentially an issue of making the switch. Though to that, many people we read who did become proficient on the Dvorak noted that for them, their brains had no issue switching back and forth between layouts so long as they continued to regularly use both. The human brain is actually pretty amazing, it turns out. Perhaps the bigger issue for these individuals was that a lot of shortcut keystrokes in various software are geared towards the QWERTY layout and can often be quite awkward on a Dvorak keyboard, though there are some ways around this if one wants, in some cases with some auto hotkey scripts that convert for you. A similar issue is often pointed out by computer programmers in that the symbol placement on the Dvorak is extremely suboptimal when programming in C and its many offshoots. Proponents of the Dvorak, however, correctly point out that all these problems are only problems because almost everyone uses the QWERTY layout. If everyone switched, you'd get a very tiny boost in speed, slightly less finger and wrist fatigue, and these other problems would go away. But of course, as it's only a slight improvement and not a game-changing one, the QWERTY keyboard, much like the useless letters Q, X, and C, persevere through today and seemingly will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. However, there are some new efforts being made for better keyboard layouts when typing with just 2 thumbs, as people do a huge percentage of the time now. But even then, QWERTY still dominates to date. As Dr. Dvorak himself aptly summed up, changing the keyboard format is like proposing to reverse the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule, discard every moral principle, and ridicule motherhood. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below and don't forget to subscribe. Also, please do check out our fantastic sponsor, CuriosityStream. I'm gonna link to them below. And as always, thank you for watching.